So we've been navigating the twists and turns of evolutionary paths and natural drift, seeing how things unfold without a preordained script. But that journey leads us right into a bit of a philosophical quicksand, a place where the ground beneath our feet seems to vanish. We thought we were standing on solid ground, didn't we? Let's see where that takes us. We started with common sense, right? Thinking our minds pop out of this big external world. But then zooming in, we hit a wall, no stable found when we look inside. Look outside, and the world itself looks like it's just a product of our interactions, our history of coupling with the environment. It's like trying to find the edge of a Mobius strip. You keep going, and eventually, you realize the inside is the outside. The text nails it. These two failures, finding no solid self and finding no solid world, are actually two sides of the same coin. Life itself is this fundamental loop, this mutual folding back and forth between organism and environment. There's no getting off the ride. The track is the ride. So, we land here. The worlds we experience, these enacted realities built through our unique histories, are fascinating subjects for science. We can study them, map their structures, understand their dynamics. But here's the kicker: they don't have a bedrock. No ultimate foundation. This brings us face to face with the big question. If our everyday reality lacks such a foundation, how do we even make sense of our seemingly solid, unshakable experience? It feels real, doesn't it? Like the floor is definitely there. Philosophers like Putnam tell us we can't even imagine what credible foundations would look like anymore. But here's the rub. Western philosophy, often focused on dissecting concepts, hasn't really given us tools to directly grasp this lack of foundation in our own lived experience. It's like describing an earthquake in great detail, but never letting you feel the tremor. Now, many folks, especially in Western thought, just shrug and say, who cares? For everyday life, it doesn't matter if the world is mind-dependent or independent. Thinking otherwise is just crazy talk, abandoning realism. But hold on, the text points out a crucial confusion here. They're mixing up two different flavors of empirical realism. First, there's realism A, the idea that our world will continue to be full of objects and events even if we figure out it's not some pre-packaged foundational reality. Makes sense, right? The sun still rises. Second, there's realism B, the much sneakier one. This is the assumption that we're somehow doomed, fated to always experience the world as if it has a solid foundation, even when we intellectually know better. This second type is dangerous because it basically handcuffs human potential, suggesting we can never truly escape or transform our experience. The big challenge then becomes, can we reject this limiting view of realism B without throwing out the more practical notion of realism A? This isn't just an academic puzzle anymore. Our current historical situation demands something more radical. Not just letting go of our philosophical obsession with foundations, but actually learning how to live in a world without them. Science, as powerful as it is stuck. As Putnam puts it, it's great at knocking down old metaphysical idols, but terrible at building new ones. It tears out the foundations, but doesn't hand you a blueprint for what to build on top. We're left philosophizing without foundations, whether we like it or not. Now, the text makes a really important point. We're not the first to grapple with this. Other traditions, like the Madhyamika school of Buddhist thought, have wrestled with this exact problem for centuries. Yet, surprisingly, Western philosophy often seems blind to this, sometimes even assuming its situation is uniquely Western. Think of Richard Rorty championing a philosophy confined to continuing the conversation of the West, seemingly unaware that other conversations might offer relevant insights. Okay, let's dive into this alternative perspective. Madhyamika, centered around the towering figure Nagarjuna. This teaching, specifically the concept of sunyata or emptiness, emerged later in Buddhist history, around 500 years after the Buddha. It caused a major split, with the Mahayana schools adopting it and the Theravada tradition rejecting it. Nagarjuna, living around the 1st or 2nd century CE, was the mastermind who really formalized these ideas into rigorous philosophical arguments, drawing heavily from the Prajnaparamita texts. He's revered as a profound thinker. His main method, refutation. He'd take opposing viewpoints and show their inherent contradictions. Later followers tried to add positive statements about emptiness, but Nagarjuna himself was all about dismantling flawed positions. And crucially, this wasn't just abstract armchair philosophy. Debates were serious business, often determining conversions. Plus, philosophy was deeply tied to meditation practice. The goal was to realize the non-self not just intellectually, but experientially, and live accordingly. So what is this famous sunyata emptiness? Don't get scared off by the word emptiness. It literally means vacidity, like empty space, not nothingness. The Tibetan tradition offers three ways to approach it, but the one most relevant to our discussion is sunyata, regarding dependent origination. This is where Nagarjuna really shines. He takes the core Buddhist insight of dependent origination, everything arises in relation to causes and conditions, and pushes its logic to its absolute conclusion. Earlier Abhidharma analysis had shown that there's no permanent independent self underlying our moment-to-moment experiences. Great. But, Nagarjuna noticed, those schools still clung to the idea that the objects of perception and the relationships between them were relatively objective, existing somewhat independently. Nagarjuna's bombshell argument is that this independence applies to all three: the subject, the object, and the relationship itself. None of them exist on their own terms. Let's look at a classic example of Nagarjuna's reasoning, focusing on seeing. Imagine you say, I the seer exist independently. What does that mean? It means I could exist without seeing this specific thing right now. Or, this thing I see, the vision, exists independently. Meaning it would still be there even if I weren't looking at it. Nagarjuna turns this back on itself. How can you even talk about a seer who isn't currently seeing that particular vision? The idea of the seer is tied to the act of seeing that vision. Similarly, how can you talk about a vision that isn't being seen by that specific seer? Again, the concept collapses. Trying to isolate any one element, the seer, the seen, the act of seeing, as having independent existence just doesn't work logically. They are defined by their relationship to each other. It is like saying, can you have a north without a south? They arise together. Okay, Nagarjuna anticipates the objections. Fine, someone might say. Maybe the seer doesn't exist before the vision. So a non-existent seer creates a real vision? Doesn't make sense. Or maybe the vision didn't exist until the seer saw it. So a non-existent vision is seen. Also nonsensical. What about simultaneous arising? They pop into existence together. Nagarjuna counters, are they identical? Then it's not really vision, which requires distinct elements. Are they separate? Then why can't a seer hear a vision? Only a hearer hears sound. The relationship itself is key. And the final blow, maybe the whole package, seer, perception, vision, is the real thing, the ultimate reality. But adding non-existent parts together doesn't create something real. And how can a single moment be real if it depends on other moments and the flow of time itself? It's a devastating logical dismantling. And this isn't just about seeing. Nagarjuna applies this same razor-sharp logic everywhere. Everything that arises through dependent origination falls under this scrutiny. Think about it. The subject experiencing things, the objects they experience, through sight, sound, touch, etc., either qualities or attributes of those things, like color, shape, texture, cause and effect relationships, even fundamental concepts like space, time, the elements, emotions like passion or aggression, ignorance, the agent performing an action. The action itself, the object act upon, the self as perceiver or actor suffering its causes, its cessation, the Buddha, even nirvana itself. The list goes on. The conclusion is breathtakingly simple. Nothing whatever is found which has not originated dependently. For this reason, nothing whatever is found which is not empty. Everything is empty of inherent independent existence. It's crucial to understand where Nagarjuna was coming from. These weren't just abstract logical games. He was targeting deeply ingrained psychological habits, the tendency to grasp onto as solid, independent entities within the framework of mindfulness practice and the earlier Abhidharma psychological analysis. So, even if a modern philosopher spots a subtle logical wrinkle in his arguments, and some certainly try, that doesn't diminish their power within his original context. Why? Because his arguments boil down to a tight synthesis. First, define what independence or intrinsic existence truly means. It means existing without depending on anything else, having an identity beyond its relations. Second, look at our actual experience. Can't we find anything that fits this definition? Nope. Everything we encounter arises dependently, as the Abhidharma intuited and science confirms. Third, therefore, the conclusion is unavoidable. Nothing possesses ultimate independent existence. Everything is empty in that specific sense. So, what does this radical emptiness mean for our experience? First, don't think Nagarjuna threw out the baby with the bathwater. He wasn't rejecting the earlier Abhidharma analysis. He was building on it, using its very categories like seer, perception, seen as the starting point for his deeper critique. His arguments are incredibly precise, not just vague hand-waving. The real shift comes from recognizing the immense power of our psychological urge to cling to foundations, a real solid me, a real solid world out there, and a real solid knowing connection between them. The text suggests that sunyata is meant to be discovered naturally through deep mindfulness. Initially, you might see no permanent self, but maybe there's still a knowing mind doing the seeing. But Nagarjuna's analysis pushes further. Even that knowing mind dissolves. There's no separate knower, no separate known world. Knowing sunyata isn't like knowing a fact. It's more like looking into a mirror. The reflection is clear, bright, but there's no extra substance behind it. While the interdependent dance of mind and world continues, there's nothing more to know, nothing hidden. Experience is simply open, exposed, perfectly revealed as it is. This leads directly to why this path is called the middle way. Why middle? Because it skillfully avoids the pitfalls of extremes. On one hand, it avoids objectivism, the belief in an absolute, mind-independent world, and subjectivism, the belief in an absolute, independent mind. On the other hand, it avoids absolutism, the idea of permanent, unchanging existence, and nihilism, the idea that everything is ultimately meaningless or non-existent. The Tibetan commentators put it beautifully. By affirming the reason-dependent origination, we avoid the extreme of annihilation nihilism. By affirming the thesis no inherent existence, we avoid the extreme of permanence absolutism. It's a delicate balance, holding both the appearance of dependent phenomena and their ultimate nature of emptiness. To navigate this, Buddha introduced the crucial distinction between two truths. Nagarjuna emphasized this immensely. First, there's the relative truth, samvortisyata. This is the world as it appears to us, the world of chairs, people, trees, the continuity of my life, the functioning of society. It's called relative because it's covered or disguised. The Tibetan term kunzup captures this nicely. It means dressed up, disguised. Think of it as ultimate reality, sunyata, wearing the colorful clothes of conventional experience. Then there's the ultimate truth, paramarthasyata. This is simply the emptiness of that relative world. It's not a metaphysical theory about truth itself, but a description of the practitioner's direct experience. Realizing that the mind, its objects, and the relationship between them are all codependently originated, and therefore empty of inherent existence. It's also a guide for contemplation. Now the term relative or conventional can be misleading. It doesn't mean subjective, arbitrary, or just whatever we agree on. The relative world operates according to real laws, like the laws of karma and causality, which function regardless of what we personally believe or culturally agree upon. It's also not about deconstructing language in the way some postmodern theories do. The Gelugpa founder, Tsongkhapa, clarifies, when we say named things are conventional, it means they are established as existing conventionally. This doesn't mean there's no referent. If I call you Juan, I'm assuming a real person, but analysis shows no permanent Juan exists ultimately. However, in the relative sense, Juan is conventionally real. You exist as a useful designation. It's similar to how we discussed color earlier. No absolute foundation for color in physics or the observer, yet we can perfectly describe colors. The relative truth is functional and real within its own domain. Because this relative, conventionally originated world operates lawfully, science is possible. Just as our everyday lives continue smoothly despite our belief in a solid self, practical science and engineering work, even if their underlying theories rest on metaphysical assumptions we can't fully justify. Now the text brings an active cognition back into play. It's not claiming an action is the only way to do science, nor is it identical to Madhyamika. Concepts like embodiment and structural coupling are valuable tools, but they are concepts, products of our historical context. They aren't meant to be taken as definitive proof that right now, personally, you lack an independent mind or world. This leads to a critical point. Some Madhyamika schools focus purely on refutation because any positive assertion, any conceptual position, can become a new refuge, a new foundation we cling to, thus obscuring the very lack of foundation the teachings aim to reveal. It's a trap. This brings us back to inaction. While it brilliantly highlights the interdependence between mind and world, there's a subtle risk. Sometimes inaction tends to treat the interaction itself, the action, the enacting process, almost as if it has a kind of solid, real existence. And here's the danger. When our mind grasps this concept of inaction as something solid and real, guess what pops up automatically? The concepts of the subject doing the enacting and the object being enacted upon. We fall right back into the trap. So, the text strongly cautions against equating practicing enactive cognitive science with actually experiencing the Madhyamaka dialectic. That would be harmful. Instead, inaction is offered as a metaphor, a bodily expression of the lack of foundation. Hopefully, it can point beyond itself, nudging us towards a deeper understanding, perhaps less rigid than other Western ideas we'll see next. Interestingly, despite vastly different starting points, contemporary Western thought and Buddhist thought have converged on this sensitivity to the lack of foundation. Thinkers influenced by pragmatism, post-structuralism, and postmodernism, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Vatimo's weak thought grapple with the breakdown of traditional foundations. Even Vatimo, while critical, sees potential in embracing this weakening of being, viewing the postmodern condition not just as a loss, but as a field of possibilities. However, practitioners of meditation often argue this convergence is superficial, a trompe-l'oeil. They see similarities but fundamental differences. The text identifies three key distinctions between the contemporary Western take on the lack of foundations and the Madhyamika approach. First difference, the lack of an entre-deux. Contemporary Western thought often struggles to articulate the lack of foundation for both the self and the world simultaneously. It tends to oscillate between critiques of objectivism and subjectivism, but rarely finds a stable middle ground. Look at cognitive science. The self gets fragmented precisely because each discipline tries to be scientifically objective, treating the self as just another object to study. The foundation for challenging the subjective is keeping the objective intact. Hume, the great empiricist, saw the problem with the continuous external world idea versus his discontinuous sensory impressions. He even suggested the idea of a continuous world is a psychological crutch, but he never synthesized his insights about the self and the world into a genuine middle way. The text gives another revealing example. Jackendorf, a sensitive phenomenologist, felt the intermediate nature of consciousness, but constrained by the scientific paradigm, retreated into a formal computational theory instead of exploring the lived experience directly. The path of direct experience seems blocked. Second difference, the subtle subjectivism of interpretativism. A powerful current in contemporary thought, especially among pragmatists and hermeneuticists, uses the concept of interpretation to critique objectivism. Their argument is sharp. To be truly objective, you need mind-independent objects. But can you actually find such objects? Goodman's famous example of defining a point illustrates this. Is it a primitive element? An intersection of lines? All definitions are valid but incompatible. Goodman concludes that beneath these conflicting descriptions, there's no neutral fact. It's all convention, like peeling an onion until nothing remains. Putnam echoes this, arguing against mind-independent objects and intrinsic properties, warning that clinging to objectivism devalues lived experience. But here's the catch. Despite their critique of objectivism, interpretativists rarely challenge the independence of the mind itself, or the independence of the interpretations and concepts they use. Those become the new implicit foundation. Third difference, the lack of transformative potential. Often, when contemporary thought confronts the lack of foundation, it reacts negatively, seeing it as the collapse of ideals for science, truth, or a meaningful life. Inactive cognition and pragmatism try to overcome this by affirming the lived world, but they remain largely theoretical, not offering practical guidance on how to actually live without foundations. Madhyamika takes a different stance, realizing the absence of a fixed self is liberating. It opens up the lived world itself as the path, the place of realization. Nagarjuna explicitly states that ultimate truth cannot be taught apart from daily practices. Embodiment is key. Mindfulness, open awareness, emptiness, these aren't abstract ideas. They apply to the contents of our experience, our attachments, anxieties, frustrations. When we see these experiences are empty of inherent existence, it manifests experientially as a growing sense of openness, less fixation. Compassion can arise, replacing the constant irritation of egocentric worry. Finally, this leads to a profound shift in understanding liberation. In early Buddhism, nirvana meant escaping samsara, the cycle of suffering driven by ignorance and craving, into a transcendent state. But Nagarjuna, through the lens of sunyata, flips this on its head. No distinction between the ordinary world, samsara, and the freedom, nirvana. No distinction between freedom and the ordinary world. Liberation isn't about running away from the world. It's about transforming how we are within the world, cultivating wisdom and compassion right here, right now. This is incredibly challenging for cultures, including our own, conditioned by the extremes of absolutism, clinging to foundations, and nihilism, giving up on meaning. Both extremes pull us away from engaging with our lived experience. Absolutism seeks escape through foundations. Nihilism gives up on working with experience. Understanding this requires a deep dive, which we'll tackle in the final chapter.